Every game, especially a good one, intuitively teaches you how to play. Sometimes it does it openly with tutorials and user interface pop-ups, and sometimes it does it without saying a word. Take explosive barrels. All the way back in 1993, the original Doom introduced players to a simple idea: brightly colored barrels that exist for gameplay, not decoration. Radioactive green slime, placed deliberately, begging to be shot. You didn't need to be told what would happen, you learned through instinct. Over time, those hazards evolved into the familiar red barrels found across shooters and other genres. Objects that made no real-world sense, but perfect game sense. Why would they explode so easily? Why are they even here? Because they are readable, they stand out, and when you interact with them, something satisfying happens. No tutorial, no explanation, just understanding. This is yellow paint, a form of signposting. The psychological and immersive use of visual, auditory, and even narrative cues that every game uses in some form or another to guide players towards objectives or places of interest without overt instruction. Like red barrels, yellow paint often appears where it doesn't belong, on climbable surfaces, on objects, and even navigational arrows. Not to decorate the world, but to translate it. It tells you where you should go, what you can climb, what can be broken, and sometimes it tells you a little bit too much. What can be a subtle environmental guidance becomes instruction. Hand-holding replaces discovery, and the immersion cracks the moment you notice the trick. So how did we get here? When did guidance stop being invisible? Is the issue really about yellow paint itself, or there's more to it than first meets the eye? In the 2D worlds of the 1980s and 1990s, figuring out where to go was simple: forward, up, down. Outside of minimal backgrounds, very little existed purely for decoration. Those worlds were built from flat surfaces and simple colors. Every element had a purpose. Bright blue ladders in Donkey Kong signaled interaction. Grabbable ledges in Prince of Persia stood out by shape alone. The warning colors of Mega Man told you exactly what was dangerous. The entire screen was already a language. There was no need for glaring signposting, and immersion wasn't based on realism, it was symbolic. But that clarity began to break as games experimented with depth. In titles using pre-rendered environments and fixed cameras, knowing where you could go wasn't always obvious. Final Fantasy VII, for an example, famously added on-screen arrows to indicate doors and exits at the press of a button, a practical solution to players getting lost in detailed static scenes. Survival horror games like Resident Evil faced similar challenges. Players often tested every wall or object, searching for what was interactable. Observation was rewarded, and progress depended on memory and map discipline. The real shift came later, when games began striving for full 3D worlds. In Tomb Raider 1996, environments were built from simple geometry: flat ground, strong silhouettes, rough edges that clearly separated floors from walls. Limited memory meant repeated textures and shapes, patterns players quickly learned to read, and all of it subtle signposting. You didn't always know where to go immediately, but trial and error was part of the experience. Running, jumping, testing walls, or grabbable points. And when you finally figure it out, the reward wasn't just progress, it was understanding, despite some initial frustration. Early open-world or more open-ended games relied on signposting too, just in a very different way. In The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, guidance wasn't painted onto the environment or layered into the UI. It lived in the world itself. Actual signposts pointed towards distant towns, landmarks acting as visual magnets to draw you, to orient you in the world. The in-game map was minimal and intentionally unhelpful, and players were often guided through dialogue, vague directions referencing landmarks, roads, or the bend of a river. progress required observation, attention, and patience. It was a form of signposting that trusted players completely, but it was also time-consuming, easy to miss, and unforgiving. For many modern audiences, systems like this feel tedious rather than immersive. And as environments grew larger and more detailed, developers searched for more ways to guide players without breaking immersion. Some solutions for signposting were then subtle or even elegant. In Eco, despite the simple textures, the game utilized lighting and shadows to draw the player to where they needed to go. As humans, we have a natural aversion to darkness, so a simple torch or a brighter path draws our attention. Nothing was explicitly highlighted, nothing was really painted, guidance existed, but you didn't notice it. Similarly, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time relied on strong geometry rather than explicit markers. Straight walls that you could run on, distinct poles, cracked rock faces that quietly suggested interaction. Crucially, like these past examples, these cues blended into the world and the graphical fidelity of the time, but as that graphical fidelity increased, even these methods began to strain. In games like Tomb Raider Legends by 2006, developers occasionally turned to white chalk marks on rock faces, unmistakable signals to encourage players to climbable ledges. One where, unlike previously, could be deemed a weak form of signposting, clearly overt, with the whiteness blending decently but looking somewhat out of place. Not quite yellow paint, but close. Meanwhile, early Assassin's Creed leaned on a different philosophy altogether, large or small repeating protruding climbable elements, clear parkour highways, without explicit markers. Carefully placed tessellation and deliberate repetition made the environments readable at a glance. Guidance and iteration built directly into the architecture for intuitive flow. For a time, it worked. But fidelity kept advancing. Textures became denser, lighting more complex, worlds more cluttered. And eventually, subtlety stopped being enough. So where did the balance finally break? When did guidance stop blending in and start standing out? We are drawn to color, not just in games, but everywhere. In film, color has long been used to direct attention and emotion. The red coat in the Schindler's List, the clash of blue, green, and red lightsabers in Star Wars. Color cuts through noise. It tells your eyes where to look. And in games, much like the explosive red barrels or flashy glowing loot colors, yellow just works. It's bright, highly visible, it contrasts against the earthy palettes most game worlds rely on, more effectively than white ever could. There's also something instinctive about it. Yellow signals caution, movement, focus, traffic signs, warning labels. As games entered the 7th console generation, something else was changing. They didn't just become more visually detailed with bigger, better engines, they became more curated, especially AAA games. Cameras grew more cinematic, gameplay streamlined, story-driven, design increasingly focused on smooth, uninterrupted flow. Objective markers became standard in our game maps, accessibility features expanded rapidly. For some players, this made most games more inviting. For others, it felt like something was being taken away. These advancements also introduced a new design problem: clarity in chaos. As environments and enemies filled with detail, they became harder to read at a glance. And so, much like red barrels before them, developers turned to color. Brightly colored weak points, often yellow, orange, or even red, began appearing in games like Lost Planet, Resident Evil, and Dead Space. Instead of an on-screen reticle or a UI prompt telling you where to shoot, the in-game graphics themselves did the pointing. A glowing surface, a contrasting limb, a moment of color amid visual noise. Much like yellow paint, glowing weak points progressively gained a bad reputation, often criticized for diluting boss difficulty and engagement down to gimmicky, poorly designed encounters that constrained gameplay. In 2007, in Uncharted Drake's Fortune, this philosophy was applied to traversal. Naughty Dog faced a familiar challenge. How do you guide players through a linear cinematic world that looks increasingly photorealistic? Their solution wasn't yet the yellow paint of today, but it was close. Faintly painted assets, such as yellow pipes, guiding your path. Like the early Tomb Raider games, these cues could appear slightly out of place at a glance, but they blended into the environment just enough to work, and quietly set a precedent. By 2013, Tomb Raider would take this a step further, applying white paint directly to many interactable elements, including individual ledges. For some players, this crossed the line, shifting from guidance into something that felt patronizing and occasionally immersion-breaking. From there, environmental signposting, whether applied subtly or aggressively, quickly became a standard practice and soon a matter of deep debate. But what if games embraced overt guidance purposely? Mirror's Edge. Here, color-coded guidance wasn't hidden at all, it was the art direction. Red or yellow wasn't subtle, it was the path, a deliberate design choice that turned signposting into a mechanic rather than a trick. And it worked beautifully. In the Stanley Parable, the game exposes signposting entirely, breaking the fourth wall as the narrator openly guides the player through the logic most games try to conceal. The bright yellow adventure line doesn't just show you where to go, it mocks the idea that you were ever choosing for yourself. By exaggerating the technique, the Stanley Parable makes the invisible visible, highlighting the design language players had been following all along. And that's where the tone shifts, because once a design trick becomes recognizable, it's no longer invisible. So when did that necessity start masquerading as part of the environment? And when did that masquerade become overcorrection? By the time we reach modern AAA games such as Resident Evil 4 Remake, the Tomb Raider reboot, Assassin's Creed Shadows, Star Wars Outlaws, the Horizon series, and more, color-coded guidance has shifted from subtle suggestions to overt instruction, not necessarily because designers stopped caring, but because the problem they were solving kept getting harder. Modern games are built with unprecedented visual fidelity. A rock looks like a rock. An interactable object is nearly indistinguishable from a decorative one. In older games, interactable elements stood out through exaggerated shape, shading, or color alone. Subtle signposting was easy, and it was easy to trust that curiosity. But in many modern worlds, and more importantly, worlds that try to be realistic, everything blends together. This creates a very real design challenge. How do you guide a player towards the one crate they need when they have walked past 20 identical crates they can't use? You can rely on trial and error, much like the older games, but hours of QA testing shows the same result. Players get stuck, they get frustrated, they stop progressing. Completion rates drop. And so, rather than adding an explicit UI pop-up that breaks immersion completely, developers reach for something easier. Paint. A splash of yellow paint draws the eye instantly, even in visual noise, much like a weak point. Take Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. At first glance, its now infamous cliff-climbing sections feel patronizing. Bright yellow paint marks every step of an otherwise simple traversal sequence. But remove that paint, and something interesting happens. The climbable rock blends almost entirely into the cliff face. Players might assume it's decorative, or worse, miss that climbing here is even possible. What looks like over-explanation is often a solution to a very specific playtesting failure. This example resulted in a massive internet debate, memes, and discussion of good or bad game design. In response to criticism, the game's director even expressed surprise at the backlash, framing the choice as accessibility consideration, much like camera options or control schemes. From a development standpoint, it makes sense, but is it always the best solution? In Resident Evil 4 Remake, the issue becomes harder to ignore. Yellow paint marks breakable objects, ladders, climbable ledges, and almost anything interactable. It's splattered so frequently that it risks becoming a distraction, something the original didn't suffer from. At this level of visual fidelity, clutter demands clarity, much like the cliff face before. How do you quickly tell the player they can interact with this window and not the dozens of others just like it? Though an argument can still be made that once players learn these cues, they carry that understanding for the rest of the game. The problem deepens when yellow paint evolves into something even more explicit, arrows disguised as environmental detail, as seen in other Resident Evil entries or Dead Rising Remake. In fact, the backlash went far enough to inspire PC mods to remove yellow paint entirely. Star Wars Outlaws went a step further, offering a mode that allows players to disable yellow paint navigation cues altogether, which raises a deeper question. Could these games be designed differently from the ground up? Could they trust players and their game design to teach interaction and progression organically? Some modern games answer this question by leaning even harder into UI, detective modes, scan visions, highlight overlays, a mechanic that solves clarity but at the cost of immersion. At that point, guidance isn't hidden in the world at all, it's layered on top of it. And yet, accessibility complicates everything when you have statements such as this. When we demoed our 2D platformer at PAX, an expo for fans of video games, we had to tell multiple adults how to hold the controller so that they wouldn't hold it upside down. Between the average player and the experienced one, the gap can be enormous. From that perspective, overt guidance isn't laziness, it's insurance. So the question isn't whether yellow paint is wrong, it's whether it's the only answer. Because some modern games, even with high fidelity, manage to guide players without ever reaching for it. And that brings us to the alternative. Failure has always been part of play, and in games, failing safely is often where learning happens. Discovering a path on your own, overcoming a small moment of confusion, creates something no waypoint ever can: a sense of understanding, a sense of reward. Games like Elden Ring, Breath of the Wild, and Ghost of Tsushima, and more, guide players through the world without relying on few, if any, painted instructions. A gust of wind, wildlife on points of interest, landmarks dominating the horizon, lighting, particles, correct use of color or sound cues, architecture that naturally funnels movement. All forms of signposting, just not overt ones. These worlds still guide you, they simply allow you to learn, experiment, and immersively explore along the way. A design that trusts the player to notice. That doesn't mean accessibility concerns disappear: color blindness, completion rates, fear of players missing content. There's no single solution that fits every game, and sometimes overt guidance is the right choice. But design doesn't stand still. From bright ladders in Donkey Kong to open worlds that quietly pull you forward without saying a word, game design keeps evolving. New solutions will emerge, better ones will replace them, and when they do, we probably won't talk about them at all, because when guidance truly works, it disappears.